You're listening to Short History Shorts audio, where history speaks louder than images. In the ancient world, few archaeological sites provoke more controversy, more emotional response, and more scholarly debate than the Tophet of Carthage. For some, it is the grim evidence of a society that practiced child sacrifice on a shocking scale. For others, it is a misunderstood burial ground, distorted by ancient propaganda and modern preconceptions. At the heart of the matter is the question, was the Carthaginian Tophet a mass grave of sacrificed children, a sacred necropolis for infants who died young, or something even more complex? To answer that, we must step back into the world of Phoenician religion, where the divine was not distant but ever-present, guiding fate, demanding reverence, and sometimes requiring terrible offerings. The term Tophet comes from the Hebrew Bible, where it was associated with a place outside Jerusalem linked to fire sacrifices and the worship of foreign gods like Moloch. When 19th century archaeologists excavated a cemetery in Carthage filled with thousands of small urns containing the cremated remains of infants and animals, the biblical term was adopted to describe it. What they had found was an open-air sanctuary, a sacred precinct just outside the city walls, often adjacent to the temples of Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Thousands of stelae, stone markers, stood in orderly rows, many bearing inscriptions dedicating the offerings to these two deities. Inside the urns were charred bones, tiny, brittle, often accompanied by the remains of lambs or birds. The Carthaginian Tophet wasn't just a graveyard, it was an intentionally constructed religious space, used and reused for centuries, filled with ritual symbolism, deliberate architectural planning, and markers that show ongoing veneration. The central debate centers on the identity of the human remains, specifically the children. Were they victims of deliberate ritual killing, offered as sacrifices to appease or honor the gods during times of crisis? Or were they infants who died naturally and whose remains were cremated and interred with great care in a sanctified space? Ancient literary sources are unequivocal in their horror. Greek and Roman writers, including Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and Tertullian, describe scenes of child sacrifice with graphic detail. According to them, elite Carthaginian families would sacrifice their own infants during periods of military defeat or drought. Some even claimed that bronze statues of Baal-Hamon with outstretched arms served as altars upon which the living children were placed, to fall into a fire below. The screams, the drums to drown them out, the public rituals, all are described in grim clarity. But can we trust these accounts? After all, Carthage was Rome's bitter enemy for over a century. It was politically convenient to portray them as barbaric, inhuman, deserving of destruction, and indeed, much of the surviving literature comes from Roman writers seeking to justify the city's annihilation in 146 BC. For many years, modern scholars rejected the idea of systematic child sacrifice, viewing it as propaganda. They argued instead that the Tophet was a burial site for infants who died of natural causes, perhaps due to high infant mortality rates. The cremation and burial in this view were acts of reverence, not violence, but the archaeological evidence complicates this more innocent interpretation. The bones found in the urns do not represent full-term infants alone. Some were as old as 4 or 5 years, and many show signs of deliberate cutting or heating inconsistent with normal funeral practice. In many cases, the cremation appears to have occurred while soft tissue was still present, suggesting the child was not a long-dead corpse being burned after natural death. In addition, the inscriptions accompanying the urns refer explicitly to offerings made to the gods, not to funerals or mourning. They often thank Baal-Hamon and Tanit for favor received, or request future blessings, indicating a transactional relationship more akin to sacrifice than burial. Further support for the sacrificial theory comes from the uniform treatment of the remains. The placement of the urns, the presence of animal remains alongside human ones, and the repetitive formulaic inscriptions all point to a standardized ritual, repeated over generations. This was not a makeshift cemetery. It was a sacred site of precise religious function. Some scholars suggest that Carthage practiced a highly selective form of child sacrifice, one that was ceremonial, perhaps involving substitution rituals where animals could stand in for children, except in extreme moments of need when human offerings were deemed necessary. This would explain the presence of both lambs and children in the Tophet, and why some urns contain only animal remains. Others propose that infant mortality and sacrifice were not mutually exclusive, that a child who died naturally might be posthumously dedicated as a symbolic offering to the gods, blending grief with devotion. Another line of argument suggests that the children sacrificed may not always have been the biological offspring of elite Carthaginians, but possibly orphans or the children of slaves, those most vulnerable in society. While there's no definitive evidence to support this, it aligns with broader patterns of ancient ritual behavior, where sacrificial victims were drawn from liminal or marginal groups. But the practice, whatever its precise mechanics, was not unique to Carthage. Similar sanctuaries, often with stelae and urns, have been found across the Phoenician diaspora, from Sardinia and Malta to Sicily and North Africa. This suggests a broader cultural pattern rooted in Phoenician religion, with Carthage merely the best preserved or most prominent example. And yet, the Tophet of Carthage remains the largest and most enduring of these sites, active for centuries, possibly receiving tens of thousands of urns. It was not abandoned until the Roman conquest, when such practices, if they indeed continued that late, were forbidden and Carthage was razed. The moral challenge of the Tophet lies in its ambiguity. If Carthaginians did practice child sacrifice, then the ancient texts were, at least in part, accurate. If not, then one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world has been maligned for millennia based on misunderstanding or malice. But perhaps the deeper truth is more complex still, that Carthage lived in a religious framework radically different from our own, where life, death, and sacrifice were intertwined in ways we find difficult to comprehend. For the Carthaginians, the gods were not metaphors. They were forces of nature and destiny, capable of destroying cities or bestowing salvation. Appeasing them was not a symbolic gesture, it was a sacred obligation. In this worldview, sacrifice, even of one's own child, might have been the ultimate expression of loyalty, courage, or desperation. Modern excavations continue to refine our understanding of the Tophet. Bone analysis, isotope studies, and cremation chemistry are helping scholars estimate the ages, health, and possible causes of death of the children interred. And while no final consensus has emerged, the scholarly tide has gradually shifted toward accepting at least a limited role for child sacrifice in Carthaginian ritual life. But the Tophet is more than a site of death. It is a site of memory, of cultural tension, and of interpretive struggle. It forces us to reckon with the otherness of the past, with the way ancient societies navigated the line between reverence and horror. It challenges our assumptions about what civilizations do in the name of the divine, and how those actions echo across centuries. Today, the ruins of the Tophet stand as silent testimony to a lost religious world. The rows of stelae, the traces of ash, the inscriptions to Tanit and Baal-Hamon, all speak of a people whose gods demanded much, and whose devotion may have known no bounds. Whether we see it as a mass grave, a sacred sanctuary, or something between, the Tophet remains one of the most haunting legacies of Carthaginian civilization.